A lot of people ask us what's the difference between the IMF and the World Bank.
So let's break down some of the key similarities and differences between the two organizations.
The International Monetary Fund, an institution that promotes global economic stability and perhaps a lender of last resort, or, as some say, an outdated organization whose policies damage the social and cultural fabric of a country.
Across Africa, governments that have been borrowing from the World Bank and IMF for decades are finally saying they're done playing this game. Kenya's parliament building was on fire in June 2024, and the people who set it ablaze weren't terrorists or coup plotters. They were ordinary Kenyans, most of them in their early 20s, who were so furious about tax increases that they stormed their own government buildings. At least 39 people were killed by police that day.
Government treat us like foreigners in this place. We are rejecting every single bill no matter what. In that finance. We are rejecting it. Every cloud.
Hundreds more were injured. And when the smoke cleared, Kenya's president had to withdraw the entire finance bill that sparked the riots, even though he'd spent weeks insisting it was necessary for the country's economic survival.
On the continuing conversation around the content of the Finance Bill 2024, and listening keenly to the people of Kenya, who have said loudly that they want nothing to do with this Finance Bill 2024, I concede, and therefore I will not sign the 2024 Finance Bill.
The tax increases weren't his idea. They were demanded by the IMF as a condition for extending Kenya's loan program, and that's when something broke. Not just in Kenya, but across the continent. Because Kenyans looked at what the IMF was asking them to sacrifice, looked at how much debt their country already owed, and decided they'd rather burn down parliament than keep playing by rules that have trapped Africa in poverty for 60 years. And they're not alone. Zambia just told the IMF in January 2026 that they wouldn't be extending their loan program. No dramatic announcement, no big press conference, just a quiet decision to walk away. Ghana, which owes the IMF $3 billion and has been under 16 separate IMF programs since 1966, is watching its economy collapse even as it follows every single instruction the IMF gives it. Nigeria, despite facing massive economic pressure, has deliberately avoided taking new IMF loans because they remember what happened in the 1980s when the IMF's demands triggered riots that nearly tore the country apart. So let me tell you what's actually happening here, because this is one of those moments where the system that's been in place for decades is finally starting to crack. The World Bank and IMF were created in 1944 at a conference in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The idea was that these institutions would help countries recover from World War II and prevent future economic crises by providing loans and technical assistance. That sounds reasonable. But here's what actually happened. The institutions became tools for wealthy countries, especially the United States, to control how poor countries managed their economies. And Africa became the testing ground for economic policies that benefited Western creditors far more than they helped African people. Here's how the trap works. An African country faces an economic crisis, maybe because of falling commodity prices, maybe because of a drought, maybe because of corruption. They need money to pay salaries, import food, and keep basic services running. So they go to the IMF or World Bank and ask for a loan. The institutions say yes, but with conditions attached. These conditions are called structural adjustment programs, and they always include the same basic demands. Cut government spending. Remove subsidies on food and fuel. Privatize state-owned companies. Open your markets to foreign competition. Devalue your currency. Raise taxes. The theory is that these policies will make the economy more efficient and attract foreign investment. The reality is that they make poor people poorer while making it easier for foreign companies to extract resources and profits. Government spending cuts mean fewer teachers, fewer nurses, fewer public services. Subsidy removal means the price of bread and fuel doubles overnight. Privatization means foreign corporations buy up national assets at bargain prices. Currency devaluation means imports become more expensive and inflation spikes. Tax increases hit ordinary people hardest because the wealthy can dodge taxes through offshore accounts and corrupt deals. And here's the kicker. Even when countries do everything the IMF demands, they still can't escape the debt. Because the loans come with interest, and the economic policies often make things worse instead of better. So countries have to borrow more just to pay back what they already owe. It's a cycle that keeps repeating. Ghana has been stuck in it for almost 60 years. Let me give you the numbers on Ghana, because it's one of the clearest examples of how this system destroys countries. Ghana has taken 16 IMF bailout packages since 1966. That's more than $4 billion in loans over nearly 6 decades. Between 1993 and 2023, Ghana spent 21 out of 30 years under IMF programs. Think about that. For 2 entire decades, Ghana's economic policy was dictated by the IMF. And what did it get them? By 2022, Ghana's debt had reached 80% of GDP and was projected to hit 104% by the end of that year. Inflation hit 54% in December 2022, the highest level in decades. The Ghanaian cedi became one of the worst-performing currencies in the world. Food prices in Ghana were the highest in sub-Saharan Africa, with prices soaring 122% in 2022 alone. Interest rates hit 30%, and lending rates reached 35%, the highest in Africa. Ghana was forced to go back to the IMF in July 2022 for yet another bailout, this time for $3 billion over 3 years. And the conditions? Massive fiscal consolidation, which is code for slashing government spending. Domestic debt restructuring, which meant Ghanaian pension funds and banks took huge losses on government bonds they'd bought. Tax increases to boost revenue. Privatization of state-owned enterprises. All the same policies that have failed for 60 years, being imposed again. And it gets worse. The IMF demanded that Ghana restructure its domestic debt, which meant forcing Ghanaian citizens and institutions to take losses on bonds they'd bought to help their own government. Retirees saw their pensions slashed. Banks took massive hits. The government essentially robbed its own people to pay back foreign creditors. And through all of this, the IMF kept praising Ghana for its progress, saying the reforms were working, even as ordinary Ghanaians watched their savings evaporate and their living costs spiral out of control. Now let's talk about Zambia, because their story shows what happens when you actually try to break free. Zambia became the first African country to default on its debt during the COVID-19 pandemic in November 2020. They owed $17 billion to various creditors, including China, and they couldn't make the payments. So they went to the IMF and got a $1.3 billion bailout in August 2022. The conditions? Remove subsidies on fuel and fertilizer. Increase taxes. Cut government spending. The usual playbook. But here's what the IMF's conditions meant in practice. Zambia had been subsidizing fertilizer for small farmers, which kept food production stable and prevented mass hunger. The IMF demanded those subsidies be cut to reduce the budget deficit. So, Zambia cut the subsidies. And what happened? Food production collapsed. Hunger spiked. People who had been getting by suddenly couldn't feed their families. And in January 2026, Zambia's government looked at the IMF's conditions for extending the program and said no. They decided economic uncertainty was better than following policies that were starving their people. Kenya's story is even more dramatic because it was young people, not politicians, who forced the government to back down. In June 2024, Kenya's President William Ruto introduced a finance bill that included massive tax increases, a new motor vehicle tax, higher taxes on bread, cooking oil, and other essentials, increased taxes on mobile money transfers, which are how most Kenyans conduct everyday transactions, and a proposal to tax sanitary pads, which had been zero-rated to make them affordable for women. The government said these taxes were necessary to meet IMF conditions and reduce the budget deficit. But Kenyan youth, especially Gen Z, weren't having it. They organized protests on social media. Thousands marched in Nairobi. And when the government tried to push the bill through parliament anyway, protesters stormed the building and set it on fire. Police opened fire. At least 39 people were killed. Some reports put the number higher. Ruto was forced to withdraw the entire finance bill. He fired most of his cabinet. And the IMF's loan program, which had been the justification for the taxes, effectively collapsed. What happened in Kenya matters because it showed that African citizens are no longer willing to quietly accept policies imposed by foreign institutions. They're asking the question that should have been asked decades ago. If we have all these resources, if we're following all the rules, why are we still poor? And when the answer is that the rules themselves are the problem, they're rejecting the rules. Nigeria provides a different model. They haven't taken a significant IMF loan since the 1980s, and there's a reason for that. In 1986, Nigeria's military government under General Ibrahim Babangida adopted a structural adjustment program backed by the IMF. The program demanded massive devaluation of the naira, removal of fuel subsidies, and cuts to government spending. The result was economic chaos. The naira collapsed. Inflation exploded. People lost their jobs. Riots broke out across the country. The political backlash was so severe that every Nigerian government since then has avoided IMF loans like a plague. Even now, despite massive economic pressure, Nigeria refuses to take new IMF money. President Bola Tinubu removed fuel subsidies in May 2023, which was exactly the kind of policy the IMF demands. But he did it voluntarily, without an IMF loan, so he could control the narrative and avoid the stigma of bowing to foreign pressure. The policy has been brutal. Fuel prices went from about 200 naira per liter to 1,200 naira. Inflation hit 32.72%. Food prices soared. But Tinubu insisted it was a domestic decision, not IMF conditionality. And technically, he's right. The IMF says they don't have a program in Nigeria. But human rights lawyer Femi Falana and many Nigerians argue that the World Bank and IMF were pressuring Nigeria behind the scenes, and the subsidy removal was exactly what those institutions have been demanding for years. The pattern is clear across all these countries. The IMF and World Bank come in promising to solve economic crises. They impose harsh conditions that hurt ordinary people while protecting foreign creditors. The policies make things worse instead of better, so countries have to borrow more, which traps them deeper in debt. And after decades of this cycle, Africans are finally saying enough. But here's the complicated part. It's not like African governments can just walk away from the World Bank and IMF and everything magically gets better. These countries still have real economic problems. They still need money to pay salaries, import essential goods, and fund development. And if they don't borrow from the IMF, they have to find alternatives, which often means borrowing from China or other creditors who might impose different conditions but still want to be repaid. China has been happy to step into the gap. They've loaned African countries over $170 billion through the Belt and Road Initiative, but Chinese loans come with their own problems. If you can't pay, China might end up owning your port or your power plant, like they did in Sri Lanka. And even though China doesn't lecture about democracy or human rights, they still expect their money back, and the interest rates aren't necessarily better than the IMF's. So the question isn't just whether Africa should reject the IMF and World Bank. The question is what comes next. And that's where things get really interesting, because some African countries are starting to build alternatives. The African Continental Free Trade Area is trying to increase trade within Africa so countries aren't as dependent on exporting raw materials to the West and importing finished goods back. The BRICS bloc, which now includes Egypt, Ethiopia, and has partnerships with several other African countries, is working on payment systems that bypass the dollar and reduce dependence on Western financial institutions. Some countries are negotiating debt forgiveness or restructuring on terms that don't involve the IMF's harsh conditions. But all of this is fragile and experimental. It's not clear whether these alternatives will work or whether they'll just create new dependencies. What is clear is that the old system is breaking down. When Kenyan youth are willing to storm parliament and face police bullets rather than accept IMF conditions, that's not just protest. That's a fundamental rejection of the entire post-colonial economic order that's kept Africa poor while making Western creditors rich. And the World Bank and IMF know they have a problem. They've started talking about debt relief and reforming their conditionalities to be less harsh. But it's too little, too late. The damage has been done. Ghana has spent 60 years under IMF programs and is still drowning in debt. Zambia tried playing by the rules and ended up defaulting anyway. Kenya followed IMF instructions and almost had a revolution. So when you see headlines about African countries rejecting IMF loans or defaulting on debts, understand what's actually happening. This isn't about African governments being irresponsible or refusing to pay their bills. This is about a system that was designed to extract wealth from Africa, not develop it. And after 60 years of being told that poverty is their own fault, that they just need to tighten their belts a little more, that the next round of structural adjustment will finally work, Africans are done believing the lie. The debt trap isn't a conspiracy theory but a documented policy. The IMF and World Bank have published thousands of pages of reports detailing exactly how their programs work and what conditions they impose. And when you read those reports and then look at what actually happened in Ghana, Zambia, Kenya, and dozens of other African countries, the pattern is undeniable. These institutions have spent decades making Africa's economic problems worse while claiming to solve them. And now that Africans are finally saying no, the institutions are scrambling to figure out what to do. But the leverage is shifting. As more countries reject IMF conditions, as alternative creditors like China provide competition, as regional institutions like BRICS create parallel systems, the World Bank and IMF lose power. They can't just dictate terms anymore. They have to negotiate. They have to offer better deals. Or they have to watch as their relevance declines and Africa builds a future without them. This is the moment we're in right now. Parliament buildings are burning. Governments are defaulting. Citizens are marching in the streets. And the institutions that have controlled Africa's economic policy for 60 years are losing their grip. What comes next is uncertain, messy, and potentially dangerous. But one thing is clear. African leaders and African people have finally had enough of being trapped in debt by institutions that claim to help but actually harm. And they're willing to face economic chaos and uncertainty rather than keep playing a game they can never win.